From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien with his weekly grain market segment. He'll share his new projections on net returns to corn, grain sorghum, and soybean production based on the just-released Risk Management Agency grain price forecast. And Dan will look ahead to this morning's USDA grain supply and demand report. Also, the final feature in this week's series on the 5 Kansas farm couples who will be inducted this evening as the 2018 class of Kansas Master Farmers, Master Farm Homemakers. In the spotlight today, Gary and Delores Rieck of Osage County. Further ahead with the latest on the Kansas agricultural weather scene, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. As always, we appreciate you being along with us. Well, earlier this week, the USDA's Risk Management Agency, which of course oversees the crop insurance program, released its 2019 projected prices for corn, for grain sorghum, and for soybeans. And those have served as the baseline for some economic exercises, if you will, conducted by our guest now. Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. He is Mike's side with us this week. So, Dan, you did crank through a whole bunch of numbers here. These do give you an idea, eventually, of potential net returns for the individual crops. What was the impetus behind this?
Well, and we hear a lot of discussion now about increasing worries about farm debt and lack of profitability, and how, as we haven't been able to cover all of our bills in the last several years, that we're seeing more financial trouble. We had thought for a while that was kind of being held off. But it seems that, again, when you look at the crop insurance prices and the prices over time, we've had runs, well, in the corn market from 2014 on, where we're just hanging around $3.75 to $3.90. If a person's cost of production is bumping into that, then I think it comes down to it's not that we can't cover the cost of production. It's that we have to live beyond that. And we have to have enough to someday actually replace machinery other than just holding it together with wire. So I guess the motivating factor behind this was to look at what level of coverage might we expect to have from these crop insurance prices. And what they are, these are the projected prices for corn, grain, sorghum, soybeans that the RMA puts out, and that they figure for the projected price, early on price, for these major crops that we're planting. For corn, grain, sorghum, and soybeans, they take the February average. For the 2 feed grain options, they looked at December 2019 corn, took the closes during February, and averaged them. And it's noteworthy for corn that number was $4. And here on yesterday's closes, we were about $3.89, but anymore that's just noise, as we hop around the markets. For soybeans, that number was $9.54, and the November futures yesterday closed at $9.36.5. So again, we're in kind of a soft lull right now. For grain sorghum, they basically took the corn price and took 98.5% of it and plugged that in. That number was $3.94, I believe, for that price. So that's a great price. But let's say you choose a coverage level on your APH, your actual production history of which so many farmers do, somewhere 70, 75%. Well, that's a great price. And, that's what your revenue coverage price is for that 75% of the APH. But the concern I would have is that, well, what about the other 25% or the other 30%?
The uncovered part of your crop.
Uncovered side. Come to the conclusion after looking at all these and looking at literally all of our crop production budgets across the state of Kansas, and plugging in these prices that, for these major crops, that at best, the RMA prices for the actual amount of APH coverage for those bushels, that's 75, 70, whatever, they come pretty close to covering break even, at least as we show in our budgets. Our budgets are strong on fertilizer, machinery show custom rates, we show hired labor. We don't show a lot of extra, in my opinion, for family living. So we cover everything except that human element, I think, pretty well. We pay labor, but do we pay ourselves? So with that, we've tried to look at irrigated enterprises, and most of those are the western third of the state and north central Kansas, and then non-irrigated for average yields and for high-end yields across the state, and looked at whether for the APH bushels we're covering at 75%, are we covering costs there, and then put the hard screws to it and ask the question of, well, it's not just those 75% of APH production. We're looking for the whole thing. It seems to make sense to adjust those RMA projected prices by the non-bushel coverage factor.
And that means adjusting downward then,
yeah,
of course.
So what happens is $4 corn at 75% APH ends up at $3 corn for 100% of your APH. And that's tougher to find anything that makes a profit on $3 corn. Grain sorghum, again, $3.94 is the planting price. Again, 98.5% of the corn price. So by the time you bring that one down, I think you're at $2.96 or $2.97. And it's surprising on dry land, non-irrigated, for corn and grain sorghum in some parts of the state, i.e. our sweet spots, and a lot of it in that central corridor of the state where we have great rains, great soils, etc. We've got some areas where if we get top-end yields, we can cover even at that 100% spread-out price for these crops. But boy, anything other than that, we don't have enough units to spread the cost out over, and we're eating some costs on the operating note.
Do you see variations for soybeans by location in the state then?
Yeah. For soybeans, of these three crops we're talking on today, non-irrigated soybeans at the conservative yields we have in our KSU Farm Management Guide budgets, soybeans for anything other than just amazing yields that are non-irrigated in western third of the state, pretty tough. Again, you have to have yields that are awfully good. I didn't include here our irrigated wheat, irrigated grain sorghum numbers. There are situations where they can come in pretty good, but boy, those have to have awfully good yields. Again, if you put a circle of wheat out there and you get 60 bushels, that's good. I mean, that's a pretty good yield, or 70 or 80. But if you plant some of these other crops where you're getting 180, 200, 220 units, then you can really spread the fixed costs out a lot more. It makes a big difference on what these profitability numbers end up and show. Now,
this is an extremely detailed analysis, and we're going to invite our producers to go to agmanager.info and have a look at all of this. But you do point out on the grain sorghum side, there may be locations in the state where even with this de facto price that you've calculated, profits could be had.
Yeah, it kind of draws me back to some work that Michael Langemeyer had done here with Kansas State before he left to go to Purdue, and he showed for that central part of the state that grain sorghum looked pretty good, and he was looking at some type of efficiency factors and stuff. These numbers don't look far off of that. And grain sorghum looks pretty decent in that central part of the state on non-irrigated at higher yield. So it's surprising that on irrigated yields in those western areas, we can show some pretty good numbers, but we have to have the units spread the costs out over. And what are good yields? Well, 200, 220, something like that. And we have a lot of ag producers out there that have, if they have the water, that they can do that. And our challenge out to the west, and then we try to show that this in these scenarios, is that when we're limited and when we got 10 inches of water, either because we're running short, physically running short, or because of some regulation that we may impose upon ourselves. And we're hoping if we do that, we're hoping for great rains.
Right.
So and not a stressful year, so we can get back up to those higher levels and make some economic profits over and above just what we're showing in these budgets.
Well, producers, we'd again encourage you to have a look at the entire analyses, and maybe these numbers and projections will be helpful for you as you absolutely finalize your planting decisions for 2019. agmanager.info. There's one more item we do need to bring up in our visit this week, Dan. That is that later on today, the U.S. Department of Agriculture will put forth another World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report on grains and other commodities as well. But what's the general thinking in advance of those numbers as to what they might say?
Well, I think for us, the story probably resides in somewhere in the U.S. and world ending stocks numbers. So you look at what's expected coming into this report, a little bit larger ending stocks, about 20 million bushels, not much, just on the edge. 1.755 billion, down from 2.1 last year, still a pretty good situation in the corn market. Soybeans down some, again, just a marginal shaving, and having to do with a little better exports, probably some crush. Crush has been pretty good of late. For wheat, projections to be just a little bit higher. For wheat, we've been waiting for these other countries to come up short on supplies for exports, and they haven't yet. In fact, they've dug deep into their own domestic supplies to do it. So we have a short-term disappointment, but in the long run, you have to wonder, by the time Russia takes from their domestic stocks and tightens up what they have, then what do they put themselves into in a situation in the future if they don't rebound and have a tremendous crop. On the world numbers, again, projections to be not a lot of change, but again, for corn, world numbers, we're down about 30 million metric tons to about 309. That's what's expected. That would be pretty good. Soybeans up about 7 or 8 from last year, up to 106 million metric tons. For wheat, down some, about 13 or so. So really not a lot of change. I think the surprises would be if the USDA throws their hat in the ring and says, gosh, we don't think we're going to be able to recover the shortfall in exports we had because of whatever was going on in terms of trade negotiations, especially for soybeans. If that happens and they just chop the number, then these ending stocks numbers in the U.S. would go up, and then the market probably responds. But they haven't shown a leaning towards doing that yet.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out when the USDA cranks those numbers out, makes them public within the hour. And Dan, as always, many thanks for the input on the markets.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. He's with us every Friday on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. And now we cap off this week's series of profiles of the 5 Kansas farm couples who later on this evening will be formally inducted as the 2018 class of Kansas Master Farmers, Master Farm Homemakers, a recognition program co-sponsored by K-State Research and Extension and Kansas Farmer Magazine. These couples are, as the program prescribes, being honored not only for their accomplishments in production agriculture, but in community service and environmental stewardship. During the first 25 or so of his 80 years, Gary Rieck benefited from quite a spectrum of agricultural experiences. While growing up on the farm near Burlingame in Osage County, he raised sheep, helped with the crop farming, graduated from Kansas State University with degrees in animal husbandry and agronomy, 6 months as a hog buyer at the Kansas City stockyards, and starting his own hog operation back on the farm. Delores grew up on a farm near Walton in Harvey County. With her education degree from Emporia State University in pocket, she started her long teaching career in Burlingame. That's where she and Gary crossed paths. Today, although at a slower pace and with their son and daughter lending a hand, they still raise feeder cattle and soybeans on their 700-acre operation. Over the years, Gary has been an opportunist in his farming pursuits, much as his father was.
Dad was a coal miner, did odd jobs, rode the rails, went to wheat harvest, anything to earn some money. And in 1931, he started a farm, and he lived in a railroad boxcar by himself, a wooden boxcar, for 5 years. And he met Mom. And they got married in 1936. And he never would talk about that, but there wasn't much to talk about.
Rough times back then.
Yes, $1 was a big dollar. And one year he had a horse and a sled, and he caught like 40 acres of corn in his arm because it was too short to bind, and put a string around it so he'd have some feed for a handful of cattle. 40 acres by hand on a sled.
That's rough.
Yeah. 120 acres here, and Dad bought 120 on the north end of it in 1943, I think. And in 1948, he bought 160 acres of land and sold it in about 4 years and doubled his money, and then bought a couple other pieces of land. And he was always buying something and selling something. You never knew what he might do.
And my father farmed, and my mother was a school teacher. And we lived on a farm. We had dairy cows, and we had some crop ground. It was stressed to go to college. And so when I graduated from Walton, I went to Emporia State. And I graduated from there, and I took a job at Burlingame, Kansas, to teach business at the high school.
And that's
where I met Gary. He called me up and asked me out. You know, I knew he was the one. I just had to convince him. And but it was like we spent our first New Year's Eve together. We were married in the middle of January. I spent it in the Faring house with him. At Christmas time, he asked me if I'd like to get married in the middle of January. His sows weren't having pigs, and I said, sure. So we were married a month later, and it's been exciting ever since. I like the idea that he's willing to take and try different things, try new things. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but he always keeps me informed. I do keep the books. I have always done that, but I love that. I really enjoy that. It's just really been an exciting 54 years.
Yeah. Well, talk a bit, if you would, about how the operation has changed over the years. At one time, Gary, you and Delores were running hogs. That went by the wayside some years ago now, and of course you've had crops all along. But how did the farm evolve over time?
Well, I had $1,500 and a '57 Chevy, and my dad said, if you want to farm, you'll figure out a way. After K-State, I went to work for Swift in Kansas City as hog buyer for about 8 months. Knew that wasn't what I wanted to do, but my dad said, you work away from home and then make up your mind. So when I come home, I bought 20 gilts and started from there. Built some buildings, and my grandpa gave me a $2,500 loan for a Faring house. And then Delores and I got married, and we bought our first piece of land in 1967. I didn't have any money, so I had to buy the poorest piece of land that nobody wanted and then fix it up. And that's what we did for a number of years.
When you say fixed it up, through conservation
measures? Clean up, make it profitable. We've got numerous conservation awards for that type of work. And started no-till farming in 1967, and it wasn't even a word then. Hardly ever worked any ground that went to milo. I worked the ground going to beans, but not to milo. Then in 92, went totally no-till. And I haven't touched anything other than terraces since then. Totally sold on the program.
You exited the hogs in 92, is that correct? Something
yeah,
there?
Right before the calamity, and hogs went to $9. Bought Holstein heifers for a few years and run them, 100 to 150 of them, when the agriculture really expanded in the 80s. When interest rates at 18%, that took care of the dairy expansion and just about took care of us. And it was bad. But you tighten your belt and don't buy anything unless you need it.
Let's visit a bit, if we might, then, about the state of the operation present day. You still run corn and soybeans primarily as your crops?
About 4 years ago, went strictly soybean because of the economics. Still run 400 acres of soybeans and about 100 acres in CRP and then a couple hundred head of cattle. We're running around 400 cattle and 1,200 acres, 1,300 acres of land for 20-some years, but had cancer in '99, and that changed everything. And I had chemotherapy and radiation, and see, I would have been 60 at that time. Cut everything way past half on cropland, half on cattle. But the person told me, he says, if you sit in that chair will have you. Yeah. So I don't want to sit in that chair yet.
And we downsized on machinery, but it was a cooperative effort. I mean, he's been clean ever since.
Yeah. Your off-the-farm activities, both involved in agriculture. A couple of the prime examples here. Gary, you were the president of the Kansas Swine Seminar. Explain for those who don't know what that is.
Well, it's a deceased operation now, or organization, but back in the 70s and 80s, hogs was really the thing. And Wendell Moyer was the instrument behind putting this together, and it was producers in the state of Kansas, and I was the smallest producer, and I was selling about 1,200 hogs a year, and I just felt like the odd man out. But it was quite an experience and quite an organization.
But you chaired that organization for a time.
Yeah, 1 year. And then was very active in the Kansas Young Farmers organization. Both myself and wife each one was president of that organization at one time, and been going to extension meetings ever since. And I still do. I'm not too old to learn. And K-State's put out a lot of stuff over the years, and it's proven. It's not fake news.
Are the two of you quite community involved here in the Burlingame area then?
Yeah, I was on the school board 16 years and the co-op board 9 years, and farm management director for a period of time. And so then I joined the Chamber of Commerce in Burlingame, which I'm still a present member. Don't do much, but I'm still a voice and still interested.
Delores, presumably you do a few things locally
yes.
too.
Yes, I taught quilt classes for probably 10, 15 years in the area. I taught on the state level, and then I made quilt presentations across eastern Kansas, and I did enjoy that very, very much. I'm an avid quilter, love it. Well, would you like to know how I got started?
Sure.
You care if I tell, Gary?
Go ahead.
We got married in January of 1965. In April, he said, I need a new boar pig, a daddy pig. And he said, I'm going to go over to Lawrence. Would you like to ride along? It's a Sunday afternoon. I said, sure. So I went over, and he said, I'll be back in a half an hour. And I set me underneath the shade tree in the car. And I didn't have one thing to do. I didn't have a book to read. I didn't have a pencil. I didn't have a piece of paper. 2.5 hours later, he shows up, and I thought, it doesn't take 2.5 hours to buy a pig. And so I decided to take up quilting, because I've always wanted to. So I keep a little bag packed at all times. So if he says, you need to set at a gate or you need to go with me, I take the bag with me, and I'm just as happy as I can be.
You obviously have had a rich life on the farm, and you're still farming and going to keep going as long as possible. Is that the plan?
Yes.
That's the plan. As long as I'm capable and don't get in people's way, why, that's my intent.
Gary and Delores Rieck of Osage County, members of the 2018 class of Kansas Master Farmers, Master Farm Homemakers, as are Gary and Becky Hattasall of Washington County, Tom and Judy McCarty of Thomas County, Jim and Miriam Nelson of McPherson County, and Mark and Joanne Knoll of Brown County. Here at Agriculture Today, we extend our congratulations to each and every one of them. We'll return shortly here on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggle to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and continuing on now with today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, yesterday, the USDA and Food and Drug Administration released a formal agreement to jointly oversee foods made from cell-cultured meat, detailing a regulatory approach largely supported by cell meat companies, livestock producers, and other stakeholders. This Memorandum of Understanding essentially codifies an approach described by the two agencies last November. The FDA will conduct pre-market consultations and oversee cell collection, development, and production through the time of harvest. Oversight will shift to the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service then during the cell harvest stage, and the FSIS will then oversee the production and labeling of cell-based meat products. The memorandum includes language detailing that both agencies will share information in order to ensure a smooth transfer of regulatory oversight. The agreement covers meat made from cells of livestock and poultry, and the FDA retains sole oversight of cell-cultured seafood, bar catfish. And the USDA plans to conduct inspections in establishments where cells cultured from livestock and poultry are harvested, processed, packaged, or labeled. They must meet HACCP and sanitation controls, and labels must be pre-approved and then verified through inspections as required by FSIS regulations, according to this new Memorandum of Understanding. And the USDA is now stepping up its efforts to prevent African swine fever from entering the United States. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA is taking additional steps to keep African swine fever from entering the United States, even as the disease spreads internationally.
Maybe we need to redouble the efforts in the light of African swine fever and the threat that it's presenting to us.
That was Undersecretary Greg Ibaugh.
We now have 40 labs across the United States that are capable of doing tests for African swine fever. So that's an extreme beef up from where we were. I think that gives us the capability of doing 35,000 tests per day if we would need to.
The new activities include working with Customs and Border Patrol to train and add 60 additional Beagle teams to sniff out illegal pork products at key commercial, sea, and airports. African swine fever is a highly contagious and deadly viral disease that affects both domestic and feral pigs. It is spread via contact with the body fluids of infected animals. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And according to a 97-page brief filed in a federal court in Washington, D.C. this week, the EPA broke away from renewable fuel standard requirements for granting small refinery waivers starting in May of 2017 and continued to deny a congressional order regarding which refiners qualify. The brief was filed in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit by attorneys on behalf of the Advanced Biofuels Association. That group sued the EPA in response to it granting 48 small refinery waivers in 2016 and 2017. In all, agency waivers reduced biofuel blending requirements for refiners by about 2.25 billion gallons in 16 and 17. Biodiesel industry officials estimate that producers lost about 300 million gallons from waivers. The partially redacted document shows the agency originally was allowed to grant temporary 2-year exemptions starting in 2005. In recent years, however, the agency granted extensions by 2 years. The EPA, according to this court brief, improperly considered the financial debts of small refiners' parent companies when examining those waiver requests. Now, when contacted by DTN, EPA officials declined to comment on this pending litigation. Many years ago, a promotional idea for wheat-based foods emerged out of south-central Kansas, one that has now taken on national prominence. March is designated as Bake and Take Month, which encourages sharing the joy of homemade baked goods locally. Jordan Hildebrand has more on this on the Kansas Wheat Scoop. Jordan?
Giving a home-baked gift is a great way to show someone you care. This March, the Kansas Wheat Commission is teaming up with the Home Baking Association to promote Bake and Take Month. For more than 40 years, Bake and Take Month has been an opportunity to celebrate relationships with friends and family by baking and sharing treats. Cindy Falk, nutrition educator at Kansas Wheat and coordinator of Bake and Take Month, said, "The purpose of Bake and Take Month is to encourage participants to bake a product made from wheat and take it to a neighbor, friend, or relative." Bake and Take Month has a long tradition in Kansas as a promotion designed to educate consumers in the importance of home baking and wheat foods consumption. The personal visit to members of the community is as rewarding and important as the baked goods that you take to them. Falk recommends trying brown and serve rolls to share with friends and family for Bake and Take Month. Or, if you're baking for a large group, like a church potluck or school fundraiser, be sure to check out the Kansas Wheat Test Kitchen's latest creation, the Hawaiian Sweet Pan Roll. These rolls will take the eaters to paradise as they enjoy the tropical treat. For these recipes and more ideas for Bake and Take Month, visit nationalfestivalofbreads.com or like National Festival of Breads on Facebook. While a month-long celebration might not be the right fit for some, Bake and Take Day, celebrated annually on the fourth Saturday in March, is a great opportunity for families and service groups to get together in the kitchen and around the oven. So, mark the date on your calendar and plan to participate. If you do bake it off, let Kansas Wheat and the Home Baking Association see your creations on social media. If you'd like to share the joy of baking, but don't feel like you have any baking talent, never fear. You can find great video tutorials on the Kansas Wheat YouTube channel and Facebook page on the basics of baking, and even some step-by-step instructions on recipes like smokehouse cranberry cheese bread, rosemary cardamom twisters, Cupid's Crunch, and much, much more. The Home Baking Association also has some great resources for beginners, as well as the seasoned bakers on their website, www.homebaking.org. Bake and Take Day began in 1970 in Sumner County as a community service project of the Kansas Wheathearts. The Kansas Wheathearts, an auxiliary organization of the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers, set out to share baked goods with family members, friends, neighbors, and those in need, generating goodwill to the community. The idea of a community member sharing a favorite recipe with someone special became so successful that the Kansas Wheathearts decided to create a National Bake and Take Day celebration in 1973. Although the Wheathearts disbanded in 2001, the tradition continues to be supported by the Kansas Wheat Commission and the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers.
Jordan Hildebrand with this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Many thanks, Jordan. We'll be back to talk Kansas agricultural weather here on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas agricultural mediation services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Now for you on Agriculture Today, the very latest out of the Weather Data Library here at K-State on Kansas agricultural weather. Aboard once more is Research and Extension climatologist here at the university, Mary Knapp. Mary, it appears we're breaking out of our winter weather that would not end, and we'll talk of the outlook. Just noting, because you've received a lot of inquiries about this, it's been awfully tough sledding of late for our cow-calf producers around Kansas.
Right. It's been pretty much the worst combination of weather for calving operations. We've had very much colder than normal temperatures, a number of places where we've had 15, 20 degrees below normal. We've had a couple of those storms that came through in February where it was rain followed by snow, which, of course, as all cattlemen know, is the worst scenario for those young calves or even for the older cattle. And just checked out in Hayes, and with the latest snow, as of yesterday, they still had 6 inches of snow on the ground. All of that's making it tough for those spring calving herds. We might see a little bit of relief, but it's kind of changing which problem you're going to be dealing with, because we are expecting some milder temperatures. Not that it's going to be warm. At this time of the year, we would expect to have our daily highs somewhere in the mid-50s. We might get into the mid-40s, and we'll take it, but it's certainly not as warm as it should be. But as this starts warming up and we get temperatures above freezing, what we're going to do is have a lot of mud and slop. There's a lot of water tied up in the soils right now, and that's going to just complicate issues.
And when you look at that and think of not only the challenges that our cow-calf folk have had in calving, but spring field work is on delay for quite a while. We're not talking about days, but weeks.
Right, and it's not just in the northern areas of the state. We talked Hayes, but north into the Belleville and the north central area. But I just came back from a trip down to Stafford County, and in that area, which is normally where we're starting to warm up pretty nicely, soils are still frozen. The wheat is not moving much at all. And while the water's not standing at the surface as it is in other places because it's so sandy there's still plenty of water in the profile, even in those areas. So that's going to be an issue. And in fact, in our mesonet operations, Chip Redmond has checked a couple of the soil temperature climatologies to see how does the soil temperature at this current time compare to our long-term record for that. Out at Colby, it was 10 degrees cooler than the long-term climatology, the coldest of our records going back to 1986. Similarly cold in the Hutchinson area. So again, that's going to be a challenge, getting those soil temperatures up warm enough to do spring planting. And as long as those soil temperatures are as cold as they are, and as long as the soils are as wet as they are, it kind of feeds on that. It's very difficult you have to thaw it out first, and then you have to drain it, and then you have to warm it up, and that can take some sunny, mild days, which haven't been on tap lately.
And the immediate forecast does nothing to help with any of that.
Right. A couple of things that we've been looking at. First, we look at just the general March outlook, and that is cooler than normal and wetter than normal, not what we need. If we look at the 8 to 10 forecast, pulling it back just a little bit, even that is still cooler than normal. They are calling for it to be drier than normal at that point, but, that's 10 days out. For the next week, the quantitative precip forecast going through Thursday of next week calls for at least an inch of precipitation across the entire state. And as you move more into central and eastern Kansas, it may be as much as 3 inches of moisture. That's a lot of moisture on top of already saturated grounds. Probably the area that would suffer the least from that additional moisture would be up in northwest Kansas, the western edges of the state, which have not had quite as much as the rest of the area. But for anything, say, east of Oakley, getting an inch to 2 inches of moisture is just going to compound the problem.
But at least the temperatures will remain largely above freezing.
Right. At this point, we're even looking at nighttime lows staying above freezing, but that's not going to really help evaporate any of the moisture that we've got in excess at this point. Looking forward towards the end of next week, where we are actually looking at a chance for the temperatures to pop up above average for the time. We might get into the upper 50s to the low 60s, and certainly we would welcome that.
Bring that on for sure. In the remaining time, want to let folks know about a new and useful feature out of the Weather Data Library here at K-State. You're calling it an Ag Climate Update. What is this, Mary?
Right. We did our first primary issue in January, and what it does is it condenses our regular climate update, a monthly climate update, which is still available on our climate website, to a 2-page summary of conditions and their major impacts, plus an outlook section of what they're forecasting for the next month and what impacts that might have. And that's available on climate.ksu.edu. Also, it will be a regular feature in the Agronomy e-update. So if you go to the Agronomy e-update and check the articles there, look for that Ag Climate Update. One of the advantages with that particular product is we tap into our specialists around the state. So we have specialists from the Southwest, the Southeast, from all the different areas contributing to what is the major impact from the previous month and how that might impinge on future ag activities.
Well, this Ag Climate Update simply adds to the reservoir of tremendous resources out of the Weather Data Library at K-State. As Mary says, the easiest way to tap into this is by tracking it regularly through the Agronomy e-Update newsletter, and that is accessed at agronomy.ksu.edu. Click the e-Update tab toward the upper right-hand part of that front page. And Mary, thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
She's Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, and our time is away for today and the week. Thanks to you for being with us, and enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.